In 1880s, Teddy Roosevelt and a guide traveled for days to find just one buffalo called Lonesome George for TR to shoot. When one travels today to Theodore Roosevelt National Park or Yellowstone or Custer State Park in South Dakota and sees hundreds of buffalo along the road, it's hard to imagine that, as the Lonesome Judge story tells us, the bison was nearly driven to extinction. No one has studied this extinction more about bison than our next speaker, Dr. Drew Eisenberg. In fact, his book, and it's available outside, and I think he'll sign them for you if you want to ask him. His book, The Destruction of the Bison, was just released in the 20th anniversary edition, which shows the continued relevance of this topic. We're extremely honored that he could be here today with us. Please welcome Professor Eisenberg.
Thank you, Larry. Thanks to everybody who put this together. This is a really beautiful facility, and I'm really glad to be here. And thanks particularly to Larry, because I've gotten the sense that this is his baby in a lot of ways. Thank you. So my job today is to explain the near extinction of the bison in the 19th century. And about 35 years ago, this would have been a relatively easy job. Back then, a consensus prevailed, and that former consensus went something like this. In pre-contact North America, bison were super abundant. Indigenous people in the Great Plains lived with relative ease off of the bison, and then the decline of the bison owed itself solely to wasteful hide hunters in the 1870s. And the history of the bison and the explanations for the near extinction are now a lot messier. One of the presenters you saw earlier today, Dan Flores, who was projected on this screen like a villain from a Bond movie, he helped make it messier. So did some other historians, Elliot West, Jim Chereau, and I contributed to that as well. How do I advance these slides here? It's one of these buttons. That's not it. Someone want to tell me which one this is? There we go. Which one did you hit? That one. All right, cool. All right. So I promise I'm going to offer an explanation for the bison, but before I get there, I want to briefly ask and answer a couple other questions. First of all, how many bison populated the historic Great Plains? And secondly, what was the relationship between indigenous people and the bison? And hopefully when I answer my third question, which is what caused the near extinction of the bison, it will be clear why I wanted to address these other questions first. So first of all, the first question, how many bison populated the pre-horse Great Plains? And the way to begin is to understand that survival in the Great Plains owes itself not to magnificence, but to retrenchment. So to us, this may seem counterintuitive because the bison is the largest land mammal in the historic era of North America, and the Great Plains is the largest biome in North America. But during the last ice age, as you heard from Chris this morning, which was not only cooler but wetter than our current times, much larger herbivores such as the mammoth and the giant bison foraged in mid-continental North America. And as the Ice Age ended, global warming and maybe human hunters as well conspired to kill off a lot of these giant mammals. But the modern bison survived the end of the Ice Age because they were swifter, and so they could outrun human predators. They reproduced faster. They required less forage than their giant competitors. And so as grasses came to replace larger vegetation in the Great Plains in the warmer and drier period that followed the Ice Age, the bison's ability to survive on this thinner forage helped it to dominate the region. So the extinctions at the end of the last ice age left the bison, sometimes called the dwarf bison to distinguish it from its larger ice age cousin, without a competitor in the mid-continental grasslands, and so the bison proliferated. This is why some ecologists call the bison a weed species in the Great Plains. So since the end of the ice age, the definitive characteristic of the Great Plains is its aridity. Between the 100th meridian and the Rocky Mountains, the average annual precipitation is only 24 inches, and much of that region receives less than 16 inches every year. But as we all know, any of us who spent any amount of time in the Great Plains, the average actually doesn't tell you the whole story. In some years, the Western Great Plains looks like Iowa, and in some years, it looks like New Mexico. Looks here, fortunately, to be an Iowa year. The Western Plains climate is characterized by droughts of several years' duration. Tree ring studies have found evidence of these droughts, some lasting 10 years or more, going back over the last several centuries. The Dust Bowl of the 1930s was by no means an anomaly. So early 19th century Americans, Europeans, who went into the Great Plains, generally speaking, saw it as a desolate wilderness. Stephen Long, who explored the Great Plains in 1820, called it the Great American Desert. But in one seemingly incongruous sense, the Great Plains were abundant. The region just teemed with animal life. So in the 1860s, for instance, the bison hunter Robert Wright, who was accompanied in the Great Plains by General Phil Sheridan, calculated that there must be 100 million bison who were in the Great Plains. And that number is simply way too high. And why did they think that there were so many bison? Well, let me explain. In the Great Plains, about 75% of the rain comes between April and September. That's when the short grasses are at their thickest and they're most nutritious. Wright and Sheridan were in the plains in the summer when most whites who were passing through the plains were there. And so they saw the plains when the grasses were at their thickest, and so they saw the bison assembled during the summer mating season. During most months of the year when the grasses were thinner, bison were dispersed into small foraging groups because the grasses had thinned out. So Wright and Sheridan saw these huge herds. They assumed that these herds were spread throughout the grasslands throughout the year. That's how they came up with about 100 million. So as estimates of range carrying capacity have become more precise, estimates of the historic bison population have fallen considerably. In the 1920s, a naturalist, Ernest Thompson Seton, estimated that maybe there were 75 million. Recent estimates have pushed it even lower. There's a zoologist who worked for many years in Yellowstone, Tom McHugh, and based on the population in Yellowstone, he thought there's no more than 30 million bison. Dan Flores looked at the agricultural census of the southern plains, looking at cattle and extrapolating from there to bison. He came up with about 27 to 30 million. I've looked at the National Bison Range in Montana and the population that was there in the 1920s, and then, again, extrapolating for the rest of the Great Plains, and it could have been as low as 24 million or as high as 30 million. But what's most important to remember about the historic bison population is not an estimate of the maximum sustainable population. It could be 24, it could be 30, maybe it was even more than 30. But that the bison population was constantly in flux. There are unpredictable ecological factors that periodically depressed the bison's population. Lightning ignited grass fires, some of which gathered enough force to become firestorms that consumed grasses over a large area. Blizzards caused bison to die in the winter. Wolves preyed on aged, diseased, and young bison. They may have killed as many as 1/3 of all bison calves every year. And in the historic plains, horses, which have an 80% dietary overlap with bison, competed with the bison for forage. So in the 19th century, indigenous people who inhabited the Western Plains, they had horse herds that numbered between about 350 and 900,000. And an additional perhaps 2 million wild horses inhabited the southern plains alone. So altogether, these horses consumed forage that might have supported about 2 million bison. So the most destructive influence of the plains environment on the bison were these periodic visitations of drought. During extended dry periods, between 70 and 90% of plains vegetation dies. This causes a significant decline in range carrying capacity. And in past centuries, the loss of forage no doubt caused the numbers of bison to decline. And this fluctuation in the bison population has probably gone on for centuries. One of the reasons we suspect or we think that this is the case is that at kill sites in the southern plains where pedestrian hunters would drive bison to their deaths, and we're going to see some of these tomorrow, or at least one of them, there are a couple long periods from 6,000 to 2,500 before the Common Era, and from 500 to 1,300 in the Common Era, when there are almost no bison remains at these kill sites, which seems to indicate steep declines in the number of bison in the Great Plains in those periods. And those periods line up with drought periods that we know from studying tree rings. So paradoxically, the absence of these various environmental pressures could have also destabilized the bison population, because bison produce very rapidly. And so when times were good, the bison population would shoot way up. Grazing populations of animals have a tendency to erupt when things go well. And then, of course, there are too many bison for the carrying capacity of the range, and then their population will plummet again. So in general, the number of factors that affects a population, hunters, competition from other grazers, environmental factors, means that there's a lot of upward and downward movement of a population. And in the Western Plains, these variables that were affecting the bison population were really numerous. So while the maximum possible sustainable bison population was probably between 24 and 30 million, the thing to remember is that that population was not static. It was fluctuating significantly. So the takeaway here is that the population was probably smaller than we once thought and much more dynamic than we once thought. So someone should use that image for a book cover, I think. That would be I'll just say, as a young man, when I sent my book to Cambridge University Press, Cambridge came back and said, here are some ideas for the book cover. And I said, anyone but that one. I like any of your other suggestions, just not that. And they said, we're going with this one. And I had no leverage, and that's what it became. So to many European and Euro-American observers, the people of the Western Plains, the Blackfeet, the Cheyenne, the Comanche, the Crow, the Lakota, they're the archetypical Native Americans. These are the people who rode horses and lived in teepees, and they're the indigenous people in John Ford movies. This morning, John Eagle said he doesn't like the term nomad for these people, and I may use that term to describe them, and I want to make clear what I mean by that. I don't mean it to cast an aspersion. Not by any means. I think unfortunately the word has acquired a kind of negative connotation because it seems to imply aimlessness and wandering. But in fact, what I mean by it, and I think what the term should mean, is that these are people who use many resources over a large territory, all of which they called their own at different periods of time. And it wasn't aimless, it was quite mindful and deliberate and informed. At any rate, when Europeans first came to North America, these societies that I've described and others like them, like the Arapaho and Assiniboine, did not live in this way. Most of them did not inhabit the Great Plains year-round. For the most part, they lived on what we might call the fringes of the Great Plains. They didn't yet have horses, and they traveled seasonally to the Great Plains to hunt bison from foot, to drive them over these cliffs at these kill sites, for instance. But they relied primarily on hunting and gathering and sometimes farming in regions outside of the grasslands. And it was ironically European, what's called ecological imperialism in North America, that helped create these bison hunting societies. By ecological imperialism, what I mean is that when Europeans came to North America, they brought with them plants and animals and also germs. And those germs had a negative effect on indigenous populations. Those plants and animals helped these European colonies sustain themselves. And it was Europeans' introduction of the horse which facilitated bison hunting, and also diseases such as smallpox, which discouraged sedentary village life, that caused groups like the Lakota and the Cheyenne and others to reinvent their societies as horse-mounted bison hunting people that moved around a lot on the high plains. This is a map that shows the route of horses into the Great Plains. And the route of horses was also the route of smallpox into the Great Plains in the 1780s. Smallpox is a so-called crowd disease. It has no carriers other than human beings, so it thrives in dense settlements of human beings where it can always find new human hosts. So in the 1780s, the Cheyenne and a couple of divisions of the Lakota had not yet fully made the transition to being full-time horse-mounted bison hunters, getting most of their subsistence from bison, not all of it, but most of it. A couple of divisions of the Lakota, as well as the Cheyenne, still lived along the Missouri in earth lodges, and they farmed as well as hunting bison from horseback. When smallpox spread from Mexico up into the Great Plains, these groups gave up on farming and they became full-time bison hunters. So farming, in addition to bison hunting, meant you had more food security. What one environmental historian has called it is a system of ecological safety nets. You're not just relying on one thing. So giving up on farming to move into primarily bison hunting meant abandoning that safety net, but it's a much safer strategy when you're presented with the threat of smallpox. And in terms of smallpox, this is a winter count. You've already heard about winter counts that shows, it's a Hunkpapa winter count that shows a smallpox epidemic in 1810, I believe. And I've used this slide in other contexts, in different talks. This is the first time I can say, if you want to see the original, you can go across the hall because it's held in this museum in, I think, the early people's exhibit that's in there. So why do I emphasize the way these bison hunting societies of the Great Plains reinvented themselves in reaction to the ecological invasion of North America, particularly the horse and smallpox? The reason I do is because for decades, historians have described European ecological imperialism as a force that only helped European colonization, not just of North America, but of parts of South America and Australia and New Zealand, that European diseases killed off indigenous people, and European plants and animals facilitated European colonization. But in the Great Plains, indigenous people turned the tables on ecological imperialism. They dispersed in reaction to disease, they adopted the horse, they figured out how to use it, they turned it to their advantage, and dominated the Great Plains for most of the 19th century. And indigenous people's domination of the plains, using bison as their primary resource, had a lot to do with the near extinction of the bison. So the Great Plains are a solar economy. What we mean by that is that grasses absorb the energy of the sun, and then through photosynthesis, they transform part of that energy into carbohydrates. Bison, as well as other grazers, eat the grasses, and they transform those carbohydrates into protein. And then predators, not just human beings, but wolves and others, hunt the bison and then consume the protein. So some energy from the sun is lost as it moves to each trophic level. So that means that the population of bison is, or the biomass of bison is smaller than the biomass of the grass, and predators is smaller than the biomass of the bison. But nonetheless, this kind of solar economy is theoretically indefinitely sustainable. To subsist in the Great Plains, nomadic societies had to adapt themselves to this as well as to the constraints of the environment. So remember how I said that bison only assembled in large herds during the summer when grasses were at their thickest and most nutritious. So the social organization of these nomadic groups had to mirror that of the bison. The nomadic groups could only assemble as large groups in the summer when they could find large herds of bison. So all of the Cheyennes, for instance, could only come together during the summertime. For the rest of the year, they were splintered into smaller hunting groups. They're following the bison that have also splintered into smaller foraging groups. So this created a puzzling dissonance in nomads' use of the bison. So in the winter months, in those leaner periods of the year when the bison are harder to find and spread out, there's a real ethic of, an ethic of hunting the bison that prevailed, and you've heard about it already in earlier talks today. This real and meaningful veneration of the bison and respect for the way the bison have sacrificed themselves for you. I mean, that persists during the entire year, but it's particularly pronounced. And rules about hunting and not wasting bison are particularly pronounced during those times of the year. But then in the summer, when the bison are assembled in huge herds for this mating season, the nomads as individual groups would also come together, and they sometimes would splurge on feasts of fresh meat, and sometimes they'd kill more bison than they needed for those feasts. So this is a really interesting question. How could these people, who venerated the bison so much, then turn around and sometimes be wasteful? And I emphasize sometimes. And I want to just say that the feasts served an important social purpose. These are summer communal bison hunts that present these groups with the opportunity to reaffirm their social solidarity. And there are some whites who are, again, traveling through the Great Plains in the summer who would observe these feasts and then say, oh, these indigenous people are terribly wasteful of the bison, they must be wasteful of it all the time, and that's just wrong. It was a feast, and I hope this isn't an inappropriate analogy, but it's like you're witnessing a Thanksgiving feast. No one eats like it's Thanksgiving every day of the year, right? So this was a moment of celebration of solidarity where for a moment those injunctions against waste would be put aside. But for most of the year, these groups didn't hunt and feast this way. Within band divisions, food resources were shared within the groups. Groups discouraged overhunting in order to minimize the risk of famine. So if you look at the number of people, indigenous people in the Great Plains, and the number of bison, and the amount of bison that they would need to harvest every year for food and lodging and other items, the nomads in the plains probably had to kill between 350,000 and 420,000 bison every year for those subsistence purposes. And almost all the bison they killed would be young cows because their meat is tastier and their hides were more pliable. But to procure some more meat in order to trade for corn and other things with villagers, they probably needed to kill more bison. There's a St. Louis fur trader who estimated that the bison killed about 450,000 bison every year. We'll say at a high level, maybe 500,000 bison every year. So was an annual harvest of 500,000 every year, almost all of them young cows, sustainable? Seemingly so, because on modern bison preserves, the bison is amazingly reproductive. They reproduce at an annual rate of 20% or higher. So if those figures are applicable to the historic Great Plains, where we have a population of between 24 and 30 million bison, we have between 4.5 and 6 million calves every year. And if we push that up to its highest level, say 30 million bison, and the highest possible percentage of cows having a calf every year, you might have as many as 8 million a year. So this would, 500,000 bison harvested for subsistence would seem to be well within the range of sustainability. But we have to remember those ecological factors: wolves, drought, grass fire, drownings, blizzard, competition from other grazers. These would depress the bison's actual increase in the historic plains. And these environmental causes of bison mortality could have affected the natural increase of the bison. So in some years, wolf predation, which could have killed between 1 and 2 million every year, competition from other grazers, which might have been 2 million, accidents between 1 and 3 million, and then the biggest one of all, drought, as many as 4 million, that could have combined to exceed the natural increase of the species. So given these environmental constraints on the bison, a yearly indigenous harvest of about 500,000 was on the edge of sustainability, right? And in a really bad year, in a really drought year, there was nothing anybody could do. So a sustainable harvest of the bison is not a static, fixed figure. It fluctuates in response to environmental change. So the nomadic people would have had to recognize these changes and adapt to them. And that's hard to do because they're divided into small bands for most of the year, and the bison's productivity varies regionally. So while some groups may have found the bison scarce, others may have enjoyed a productive year. So given enough time, I think these indigenous people could have easily figured this out. That's how sustainability works. Sustainability is not a magic formula that everybody just knows. Societies arrive at sustainability through a process of trial and learning from your errors. So sustainability is messy, with people continually tweaking their practices based on what works and what doesn't work, which is exactly what indigenous people in the Great Plains were doing. They were figuring out a sustainable reliance on the bison in a dynamic environment in which the bison population goes up and down. Unfortunately, they didn't fully get a chance to work this out. In 1831, a steamboat ascended the Missouri River as far as present-day Montana. Steam technology opened up commerce in bison robes. Previously, bison robes were too bulky to ship out of the Great Plains by canoe. So over the next 3 decades, indigenous hunters supplied American traders with about 100,000 bison robes every year, and that's in addition to what they were taking for subsistence. That meant about a 20% increase in what they were already hunting. And within a couple of decades, Native people, as well as US agents and fur traders, began to notice a diminishing number of bison in the grasslands. Again, in time, indigenous people could have figured this out, how commerce would fit or wouldn't fit in with a sustainable reliance on the bison, but they didn't get that opportunity. So, Dan Flores alluded to this image earlier as I answer what caused the near extinction of the bison. It's deeply scary. One of the things he didn't mention, he did say that this metaphorical figure of progress was trailing telegraph wires behind her, but neglected to mention that she also is holding the Bible under her arm. To my mind, the people who are fleeing this are doing exactly the right thing, because that's what I would do if I was confronted with this. So what caused the near extinction of the bison? In the early part of the 19th century, the 1820s or so, the United States was a moderately sized republic and a third-rate economic power. And by the second half of the 19th century, the United States was emerging as a continental empire and a major industrial economy. In fact, by 1900, the US led the world in manufacturing output. And we tend to think of industrialization as something that happened in the East and had little or nothing to do with the pastoral West. But in fact, these two things are closely tied to each other. Industry needs resources. It needs timber, it needs minerals, it needs farmland and ranch land. That's why in the late 19th century, it was the world's industrial powers that established empires: Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, Russia, and the United States. All but the last two had to go overseas to establish their empires. Russia, however, expanded to its east, the United States expanded into its west, and both then attached those empires to their cores. And the near extinction of the bison was at its root the result of a spasm of imperial and industrial expansion into the Great Plains. And let me emphasize the industrial part. In the 1870s, thousands of white hide hunters used accurate, large-bore rifles that had been developed during the Civil War. The hides they collected were shipped east by rail. A number of rail lines had stretched into the Great Plains in the 1870s. And they shipped them east where tanneries used new chemical processes to transform bison hide, which is different from cowhide, into leather. And leather, I should point out, was the 5th largest industry in the United States in the 1870s and 1880s. In this period before synthetic fabrics, leather was used for all sorts of things, including being used as belting for industrial machinery. And because bison leather turned out to be highly elastic, a lot of bison leather wound up as belting in industrial machinery. So I'll just say, this is a still hunt. This is how hide hunters in the southern plains in the 1870s and in the northern plains in the 1880s killed bison. They would locate what was called a cow group. This is one of these smaller groups, not in the summer larger groups, but the smaller foraging groups. A cow group would have 20 to 100 bison in it. It would be led by the oldest and smartest cow, the lead cow. And a smart hunter is going to pick off that lead cow with his first shot. The cow will then fall, unless the other bison smell blood, in which case they will run away. They'll look to the lead cow, but the lead cow is just lying there, and a smart hunter will just pick off one animal after another, and picking off the most alert ones before they run away, and he will have amassed a dozen or more. And then he goes back to the camp, and he's done for the rest of the day, and then he's got 3 or 4 skinners working for him who go out and skin the hides. In the early years of the slaughter, these hunters were especially wasteful. Poor hunters would wound 2 or 3 bison for every one they actually brought down. Skinners would ruin hides as they were taking them off the bison. So in 1872, which is one of the first years of the slaughter, every hide that is shipped to market probably represented 5 dead bison. And by the end, when they were much better at it, every hide shipped to market still represented 2 dead bison. So how many bison might they have killed? According to their own estimates, a common hide hunter killed about 20 every day. The Newton Kansan, a newspaper, reported in 1872 that there are 1,000 hide hunters in the southern plains. If you have 1,000 hide hunters in the plains for just 3 months of the year and they're killing 20 bison a day, they could easily have destroyed over 2 million animals every year. And the constant pressure of hide hunters on the herds upset the bison's patterns of foraging and assembling for the mating season, so reproductive success declined under this constant pressure. And it's not like the environmental pressures that I was talking about earlier somehow disappeared. In the southern plains, oh, by the way, this is Dodge City, which was originally called Buffalo City and was a major collection site for hides on the southern plains. So in the southern plains, there's a bovine disease, Texas fever, which may have contributed to the demise of the bison. The disease, which affects grazing animals in warm climates, is caused by parasites which are transmitted by certain ticks. Texas longhorns, and there are several million of them in the southern plains by the end of the Civil War, carried the tick, but they themselves were immune to it, but the tick could drop off of Texas longhorns and attach itself to bison, and it would affect bison as well. Texas fever appeared as far north as Wyoming in 1885. And in the northern plains, the demise of the bison resulted primarily from a combination of drought and ranches. So acute drought tends to shrivel the short grasses that grazing animals depend on. But it also has an effect on tall grasses and in that region in between where they're mixed together. But when drought shrivels short grasses in the drier western plains, what it does is it opens up niches for short grasses to expand into in what had been the mixed grass plains or the tall grass plains. So bison, when they could move wherever they wanted to go, in periods of drought, they would kind of migrate toward the east. They would follow the short grasses, which is the grasses that they preferred to eat. So as long as bison could move eastward in search of forage, they could mitigate the impact of drought. But by the 1870s, they faced an obstacle. Between 1874 and 1880, the number of cattle in Wyoming went from 90,000 to over 500,000. There were already 500,000 by 1883 in eastern Montana. So domestic cattle moved into the northern plains from the south and the east, and it occupied the regions to which bison ordinarily migrated during periods of drought. So when drought struck the northern plains in the 1870s and the early 1880s, the bison had almost nowhere to go. And now here comes the shot you've all been waiting for. This is the Michigan Carbon Works in Detroit. So when the bison were largely hunted out, the plains were strewn with their bones. Settlers collected them and then they brought them to depots where dealers would buy them for pennies per ton. So for instance, when Wyatt Earp came to Dodge City in 1876, the town's railroad station was surrounded by a huge barricade of bison bones that settlers and others had brought and sold to the railroads. And then these bones were shipped east, places like the Michigan Carbon Works, where they were ground down and made into things such as fertilizer. So the causes of the destruction of the bison are complex. The American industrial economy was the primary cause. The United States lurched into the plains in the 1870s in a spasm of industrial expansion, railroad, heavy long-range rifles, new chemical techniques to process bison hides. But there's another force at work, and that's the plains environment. So in just a few short years, these two dynamic forces, the plains environment and the American industrial economy, combined to obliterate millions of bison that had inhabited the grasslands. But there's a little more to the story. So if the natural environment contributed to the bison's demise, so too did the cultural environment in which all economic behavior is embedded. So there were social reformers in the 1870s and 1880s who opposed the slaughter of the bison. And advocates of animal protection led the fight. This is a movement that emerged in the United States after the Civil War. One of the leaders was this guy, Henry Bergh. He was a wealthy New Yorker, and he founded the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals in 1866. And by 1874, there are chapters in all the largest cities in the Northeast and the upper Midwest. Urban middle-class members of the SPCA believed that the prevention of cruel treatment of animals would counteract aggressive amorality in these new, large, industrial urban places. This, by the way, is an image that hangs in the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City. Anti-cruelty was also a decidedly feminizing movement. A lot of women belonged to the SPCA, and it was invoking a domestic ethic of anti-cruelty. And the people who belonged to these societies believed that pet keeping and preventing the cruel treatment of animals would instill in young men and boys a kind of ethic of kindness. So anti-cruelty animals focused their attention largely on urban and suburban animals, pets, carriage horses, stray dogs. The destruction of bison, though, excited Henry Bergh and the SPCA to action. In the 1870s, Bergh received a number of letters from people who had traveled through the Great Plains and described the destruction of the bison. One of those was an Army lieutenant colonel, a guy named A.G. Brackett. He protested the slaughter of the bison to Bergh. Brackett depicted the bison much in the same way that this slide, this cartoon, which is drawn by Thomas Nast, who was the staff cartoonist for Harper's Weekly. Brackett presented the bison as harmless and defenseless. It was a gentle, nearly domesticated animal. It was as close to a cow as you could imagine it being. Bergh forwarded Brackett's letter to the New York Times, to a number of members of Congress. One of those members of Congress, Greenberry Fort, who was a rather iconoclastic Republican from Illinois, sided with Bergh's campaign. He introduced a bill into Congress in 1874 that would have made it, and I'm quoting, "unlawful for any person who is not an Indian to kill, wound, or in any manner destroy any female buffalo of any age found at large within any of the territories of the United States." And Fort made his sympathies very plain. He introduced Brackett's letter into the debate, and he said, "For my part, I favor the society which has in view the prevention of cruelty to animals." But while Fort and his supporters depicted the bison as already domesticated, the man on the right, Columbus Delano, who was the Secretary of the Interior, was one of the people who maintained the destruction of the bison was the only thing that would force non-reservation indigenous people in the Great Plains to submit to the reservation system. He wrote in his annual report in 1873, "The rapid disappearance of game from the former hunting grounds must operate largely in favor of our efforts to confine the Indians to smaller areas and compel them to abandon their nomadic customs." And what Columbus Delano was saying had more or less been the policy of the United States since the late 1860s. The Civil War had prompted a lot of violence in the West between whites and indigenous people. One of the most important conflicts was the Red Cloud War between the United States and, on the other side, the Lakota, the Northern Cheyenne, and the Northern Arapaho. The indigenous people were fighting to protect the Powder River Valley in northeastern Wyoming and stretching up into southern Montana. This was the best remaining bison hunting territory in the Great Plains. But the United States had built a road from Fort Laramie up to Bozeman, Montana, the Bozeman Trail, in order to reach the gold mines in Bozeman. Long story short, the United States lost this war. In December 1866, the Lakota and their allies obliterated a cavalry unit. In response to that defeat, Generals Ulysses Grant and William Sherman asked Congress to appropriate money and men to, and I'm quoting them, "carry on formidable hostilities against the Indians until all the Indians or all the whites on the Great Plains are obliterated." Congress, however, was weary of war, and instead they sent out a peace commission to deal with Red Cloud, and they forced William Sherman to be on that commission. And being on that commission could not have made Sherman very happy, nor could he have been very happy about having to concede to the Lakota an enormous territory. But he also noticed that the bison were declining in the Great Plains. And Sherman, who, as you may know, had contributed to the Union victory in the Civil War by helping destroy resources in the Confederacy by marching from Tennessee to Georgia and then to South Carolina, tearing up railroads and cutting telegraph lines, in order that these resources could not support the enemy in the field. He wrote a letter to his brother, who was a US Senator from Ohio, and he said, and I'm quoting him, "The Commission for present peace, had to concede a right to hunt buffaloes as long as they last, and this may lead to collisions, but it will not be long before all the buffaloes are extinct near and between the railroads." And so lawmakers friendly to Sherman and Delano argued quite against the SPCA's depiction of the bison as a nearly tame animal, that basically the bison was a wild resource of indigenous people, cattle was the domesticated resource of whites, and that domesticated resource must replace the bison. So Fort's bills failed in 1874, and again when he reintroduced it in 1876. So private hide hunters destroyed the bison. They forced indigenous people to surrender to the reservation system. The Army didn't go out and destroy those bison directly, but Sherman looked on approvingly as these private hide hunters did it. And the American industrial economy accomplished what the US Army could not. It forced many indigenous people to submit to the reservation system. So I have more to say, but I'm going to leave it there. But I just want to conclude by saying there are a lot of romantic notions about the frontier and the wilderness, and these romantic ideas once pervaded our understanding of the bison. As I promised you, I've tried to present a messier story, one that I'm trying neither to idealize Native people nor to fully demonize those hide hunters. What I want to do is try to contextualize indigenous people and Euro-American uses of the bison. Bison hunters, even people who tried to conserve the bison, whether they were indigenous or white, were entangled in a host of social and economic concerns. And all human societies are embedded in those concerns, as well as being embedded in the non-human natural environment. And that environment is an agent and a presence in human history. Thank you.